The stone was cold through the thin knees of her trousers. Orla's world was a map of cold stone, the geography of other people's lives written in dirt and scuffs. She knew the king's path from his study to the council chambers by the faint wear in the marble, a shallow river carved by the weight of his boots. She knew the Queen Mother preferred the East Terrace, by the wine stains that bloomed like dark flowers near the balustrade. She knew who was cheating at cards, who was drinking too much, and who wept in the gardens at night, all from the evidence left behind for her to erase. Her own life was the opposite of a stain. It was the clean, damp scent of lye soap and the whisper of a soft cloth, a presence defined by its ability to remove all traces of itself. For 3 years, she had loved King Rorik this way. From a distance, on her knees, through the scent of lemon oil and beeswax. It was a stupid, pointless love. A weed growing in a crack in the stone. He was the Alpha King, a man whose presence was a physical force, a weight in the air that made lords and ladies bow their heads without thinking. She had seen him fell a charging boar with one hand and soothe a crying child with a touch so gentle it made her own chest ache. He was granite and quiet thunder, a being of such profound power and solitude that loving him felt like loving a mountain. Impossible. Absurd. And yet, her heart was a stupid, stubborn thing. He never saw her, not once. She was part of the castle's machinery, the silent human clockwork that kept the halls gleaming. When he passed, his eyes were always on the horizon of his own thoughts, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were another flagstone, another tapestry. She didn't resent it. It was the proper order of things, a king and a scrubber, a mountain and a weed. To be seen by him would be a disruption, a mistake. So she perfected her invisibility, making herself small and useful, her worth measured in buckets of clean water and floors that shone like dark mirrors. Her silence was her service. Her invisibility was her offering. Tonight, that offering was ending. Myrta, the head housekeeper, had cornered her in the linen closet, her face pinched with the sour satisfaction of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. "The king is to be formally betrothed," she'd said, her voice crisp as starched linen. "Lady Annalise of the Sunstone Pack. A suitable match. There will be changes. We'll be scrubbing the guest wing from floor to ceiling. You'll start at dawn." Myrta's words weren't cruel, not precisely. They were simply a statement of fact. But for Orla, they were a verdict. A suitable match. Of course he would have a suitable match. A woman of power and light. A woman who belonged in the sun on the East Terrace. A woman who would leave no stains for Orla to clean. The thought was a sharp physical pain, a hook in her ribs. It wasn't the betrothal that broke her. It was the sudden, stark clarity of her own life. A life spent erasing the evidence of other people's living while having none of her own. She had convinced herself that this quiet, aching service was enough, that it was a kind of peace. It wasn't peace. It was surrender. She finished her work, her movements automatic, her hands raw in the cold water. She emptied her bucket, rinsed her cloths, and hung them on the drying rack in the scullery. She did not go to her cot in the servants' quarters. Instead, she walked through the silent castle, her soft shoes making no sound on the floors she knew so intimately. She passed the council chamber, the great hall, the foot of the stairs leading to the royal wing. She walked out a small postern gate used by the gardeners, a gate no one ever guarded. The night air was cold and smelled of damp earth and the promise of rain. She didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at. A weed doesn't have roots. It just lets go. The air in the king's study was stale, with the ghosts of old arguments and sleepless nights. Rorik leaned over a map of the northern marches, the parchment a pale, bloodless skin under the lamplight. His jaw ached from clenching it. For a week he had felt a grinding disquiet, a wrongness at the very edge of his senses he could not name. It was like a string on a finely tuned instrument had been cut. The silence it left behind was louder than the snap. He scrubbed a hand over his face. He was tired. Tired of the border disputes, of the endless petitions, of the carefully worded advice from his council that always felt more like a cage than a guide. They urged him to marry, to secure the line. They brought him lists of suitable alphas, women of good breeding and powerful packs. Lady Annalise was at the top of the list. He knew his duty. He had done his duty his entire life, ever since... before. He had lost once. He knew the cost of that kind of connection, the gaping wound it left in the world. He would not risk it again. A political match was a fortress. Safe. Empty. A sudden, violent shudder racked his body. It was not a physical chill. It was a tearing sensation deep in his soul, a visceral snap of something vital. A rope under tension, suddenly severed. He stumbled back from the table, his hand flying to his chest. There was no pain. There was only absence. A hollowed-out feeling so vast and immediate, it stole the air from his lungs. The disquiet of the past week was a whisper. This was a scream. He didn't understand. He was not injured. He was not ill. But some fundamental part of his world had just fractured, leaving a void that was cold and terrifyingly absolute. His wolf paced frantically beneath his skin, whining, searching for a scent that wasn't there. What scent? He pushed the thought away, trying to anchor himself to the room. The leather of his chair, the smoke from the candles, the dry scent of ink. But beneath it all, there was a new and terrible nothing. For years, a faint, almost subliminal scent had lingered at the edges of his perception in the castle. Clean linen, rainwater, and something else, something like chamomile, a scent of quiet, of peace. He had never consciously registered it, but his wolf had, and now its absence was a physical blow. The fortress he'd built around his heart had been breached from the inside, and he didn't even know how. He stood alone in the center of his study, the most powerful man in the kingdom, and felt a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. Something was gone, something he hadn't even known he had. The next morning, the feeling was worse. The hollow space inside him had grown, an ache that gnawed at the base of his skull. He stalked the halls of his own castle like a caged predator, his senses stretched to their breaking point, searching for the source of the wrongness. His guards stiffened as he passed, their bodies instinctively reacting to the waves of raw, uncontrolled power rolling off him. He ignored them. He was hunting. He just didn't know what for. He found himself in the West Wing, a place he rarely walked. The morning light streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The floors gleamed. They were always clean. He had never once considered the hands that made them so. But now, the scent of lye soap was sharp, aggressive. The underlying note of peace, of rain and chamomile, was gone. Utterly. "Who cleans these floors?" he demanded of the nearest guard. The man, a young beta named Torvin, blinked in surprise. "The household staff, Your Majesty. The scrubbers." "Which one?" Rorik's voice was a low growl. He felt a desperate, illogical urgency. I don't know, sire. There are several." Of course there were. Faceless, nameless people who kept his world running. He had never needed to know their names, but now he needed it like he needed air. "Find out. Find the one who works this hall. Bring her to me." He waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity of tightly coiled tension. The guard returned with a pinched, severe-looking woman whose scent was sour with disapproval. Myrta, the head housekeeper. She curtsied, her movements sharp and resentful. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" "Not you, the scrubber, the one who cleans this wing." Myrta's thin lips tightened. "The girls rotate, sire. There is no single one." "There is," Rorik insisted, the certainty of it a cold stone in his gut. His wolf knew. Her scent, rain, clean clothes. He felt like a madman, describing a ghost. A flicker of something, annoyance, contempt, crossed Myrta's face. "Ah, you must mean Orla. She is no longer in the castle's employ." Orla. The name was unfamiliar, but the moment she said it, the hollow space inside him gave a painful twist. Yes, that was it. "What do you mean, no longer in our employ?" "She left, sire, 2 nights ago, gathered her things and walked out, no notice. These girls, they are unreliable, no loyalty." Left. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. She had left. And when she did, she had taken a part of him with her. He didn't understand how. He didn't understand why. He couldn't even recall her face. He had a vague impression of brown hair always tucked into a cap, of a lowered gaze, of someone who moved through the world without taking up space. It wasn't enough. "Why?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Myrta shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "Who can say? She was a quiet thing, kept to herself. She was nothing, sire, just a scrubber, easily replaced." Nothing. The word ignited a fire in his blood, a rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded him. He took a step toward the housekeeper, and for the first time in her miserable, pinched life, Myrta knew fear. The sheer force of his presence bent the air around them. "No one in this castle is nothing," he snarled, the sound ripping from his throat. "You will give me her records. You will tell me everything you know. Where she came from, if she had family, friends. You will tell me now." She stammered out what little she knew. A village to the south, Briarwood. An orphan, no family. A stable hand, Finn, had spoken to her sometimes. That was all. It was a start. He turned from her, leaving her trembling in the hall. He strode toward the records office, his purpose a cold, hard flame in the hollow place inside him. He would find this Orla. He would find the woman whose face he couldn't remember and whose absence was tearing him apart. He would scour the entire kingdom if he had to. He would bring her back. He had to. The alternative was unthinkable. This gaping void inside him could not be borne. Orla had thought leaving would be a release. She had imagined a life where she was not defined by what she could scrub away. A life where she might, perhaps, leave a mark of her own. She found work in Briarwood, a small, sleepy village nestled in a river valley, mending nets for the fishermen down by the water. The work was hard, the twine rough against her palms, but it was honest. For the first time, her hands were creating instead of erasing. But the ache was still there. It had followed her from the castle, a phantom limb that still felt the cold of the stone floors. At night, in her small attic room above the cooper's shop, she would lie awake and feel a strange pulling sensation in her chest, a profound homesickness for a man who didn't know she existed. She told herself it was just the foolish love of a foolish girl. It would fade. It had to. She made herself useful. It was the only way she knew how to be. She helped the cooper's wife with her mending. She learned to salt fish from the old women on the docks. She fetched water for the baker. She was quiet, helpful Orla. She was still invisible, but here it felt like a choice. She was building a wall of small, useful tasks around herself, hoping it would be enough to keep the longing at bay. One afternoon, a week after she'd arrived, she was sitting on the docks, a tangle of netting in her lap, when a ripple of unease spread through the village. It started with the dogs, a low, nervous whining that turned into frantic barking. Then the people. They stopped their work, their heads turning as one toward the single road that led into Briarwood. A presence was coming, an authority so immense it was a change in the weather. Orla's blood went cold. Her hands stilled on the net. She knew that feeling. It was the weight in the air that preceded a storm. It was the pressure of a mountain. It was him. Impossible. He couldn't be here. Why would he be? He didn't know her. He didn't see her. But the feeling grew stronger, a physical pressure that made her want to drop her head and press herself to the ground. Then she saw him. He rode into the village square, not on a grand war horse, but on a simple black charger, unadorned. He wore no crown, no royal finery, just dark leather trousers and a tunic. But there was no mistaking him. King Rorik. He dismounted, his movements economical and powerful, and the entire village fell silent. He was larger than she remembered, a solid, immovable fact in the center of their small world. His gaze swept the square. It was the same look she had seen 1,000 times in the castle, distant, searching, seeing past everything. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't unfocused. It was honed. He was hunting. His eyes scanned the crowd, passing over faces, dismissing them. Then they landed on her. And they stopped. For the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King looked at Orla, and he saw her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air left her lungs in a rush. There was no recognition in his eyes, not of a person he knew. There was something else, something raw and desperate and relieved. It was the look of a man who had been drowning and had just found air. He took a step toward her, and then another. The villagers melted away from his path, parting like water before a ship's bow. He didn't seem to notice them. He didn't seem to notice anything but her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the scent of horse and leather and the cold, clean air of his northern homeland. He just looked at her, his gray eyes intense enough to burn. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, raw, as if he hadn't used it in days. "There you are," he said. And the 2 simple words held a universe of pain and relief. The world had shrunk to the space between them, the villagers, the docks, the scent of fish and river mud. It all faded to a dull hum at the edge of her hearing. There was only the king, standing before her, his presence a solid wall she could feel without touching. He was not behaving like a king. He did not command or demand. He just watched her, his gaze so focused it felt like a physical touch, pinning her in place. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was impossible. A mistake. He had mistaken her for someone else. He had to have. "Your Majesty," she managed, the words a dry whisper. She tried to curtsy, to make herself small and appropriate, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen. "Orla," he said. Her name. He said her name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a tremor through her. He knew her name. How? "Why are you here?" she asked, the question bolder than anything she had ever said in her life. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "When you left," he began, his voice low, "something broke." She stared at him, uncomprehending. I don't understand. I was just a scrubber. The words came out, the old litany of her own worthlessness, a familiar, miserable comfort. No, he said, and the word was sharp, absolute. He took another step, closing the distance between them. You are not just anything. He looked lost, frustrated, like a man trying to describe the color of the sky to someone born blind. I don't have the words for it. It's a connection, a bond. When you left the castle, it tore. I felt it. A bond. The word hung in the air. She knew the stories, of course. Every shifter did. Fated mates, a bond of the soul that was biological, inescapable. But those were stories for kings and ladies, for powerful alphas, not for her, not for a nameless, faceless scrubber. It was a cruel joke. That's not possible, she whispered, shaking her head. You and we are not... I didn't believe it either, he cut in, his eyes dark with a pain she was beginning to recognize. I didn't want it. He paused, and the admission seemed to cost him something. I lost my first mate a long time ago, before I was king. I know what this costs. I swore I would never... I built walls. I kept everyone at a distance. I never looked. I never let myself see. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, and his expression was stripped bare of all kingship. It was just a man, wounded and raw. It didn't matter. The bond formed anyway, quietly, without my permission. And I was a fool. I never noticed until it was breaking. He was telling her the truth. The sheer, unadorned agony in his face was too real to be a lie. The king of all shifters, the most powerful man alive, was standing on a fishing dock in a tiny village, confessing his weakness to a woman he'd never spoken to before. The absurdity of it was staggering. And beneath the shock, a tiny, treacherous seed of hope began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. He wanted her to come back. She could feel the unspoken demand thrumming in the air between them. But he didn't say it. He just stood there, waiting. He had all the power in the world. He could have dragged her from the village, thrown her over his horse, and no one would have dared to stop him. But he didn't. He was giving her a choice she had never been given in her life. He was waiting for her answer. His restraint was a more powerful argument than any command could ever be. It was the first gift he had ever given her. That night, he didn't take her to the inn. He didn't command the village headman to give him his house. He asked Orla where she was staying, and he followed her to the small, cramped attic room above the cooperage. The space was tiny, barely big enough for her cot and a small chest. The ceiling sloped so low on one side that a tall man would have to stoop. When Rorik entered, the room seemed to shrink to the size of a shoebox. He filled it completely, his presence sucking all the air out. He had to duck his head to keep from hitting the beams. He looked around at her meager belongings, a spare tunic, a worn blanket, the small, crudely carved wooden bird Finn had given her as a farewell gift. His face was unreadable. Orla stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him. She felt exposed, her small, poor life laid bare for his inspection. She expected contempt, or at least pity. He didn't offer either. He simply moved to the far wall, the one with the low sloping roof, and slid down to sit on the floor, his back against the rough-hewn planks. He stretched his long legs out, his boots taking up most of the available floor space. He didn't sit on her cot. He didn't take the only stool. He put himself on the floor, below her eye level. It was a deliberate act of submission, a reversal of all the world's logic, a king on the floor of a servant's room. "You don't even know my name," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. It was a test. He met her gaze without flinching. I do now, Orla. He paused. But you're right, I didn't. And there is no excuse for it. I was so afraid of looking, I forgot how to see. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she'd ever noticed in the castle. I don't ask you to forgive that. I just ask that you let me learn. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the distant sound of the river. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He just waited. He was ceding her the power, letting her control the space, the time, the decision. For a girl who had never had any power at all, it was a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. She had spent her life believing she had no value beyond what she could provide. Now the most powerful man she had ever known was telling her that her mere presence was enough, that her absence was a wound. It was too much to take in. It felt like trying to drink the ocean from a teacup. Finally, she moved. She walked to her cot and sat on the edge, her back to him. My mother died when I was born, she said, her voice quiet. My father, he said I had cost him the only thing he ever loved. He never looked at me either. Not really. He looked at me and saw what he'd lost. She had never told anyone that. The words felt like stones she was pulling from her own throat. I learned early that being invisible was safer, that being useful was the only way to earn my space in the world. She heard him shift behind her. He was a fool, Rhys said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at a treasure and saw only a debt. Her breath hitched. He wasn't just saying the words, he believed them. And in his belief, she felt the first crack appear in the thick wall she had built around her heart. A fire broke out in the village 2 days later. A spark from the blacksmith's forge caught the roof of the neighboring stable, and the dry old wood went up like a torch. Panic erupted. People shouted, ran for buckets, their efforts chaotic and small against the growing blaze. The horses screamed in terror from inside the burning building. Orla was running with a bucket of water when a wall of heat and power shoved her back. Rhys moved past her, his face grim, his eyes blazing with an alpha's command. "Get the women and children to the river," he roared, and his voice cut through the panic like a knife. People stopped, looked at him, and for the first time, they saw the king, not just the stranger. They obeyed instantly, the ingrained instinct to follow a true alpha overriding their fear. He didn't wait to see if they listened. He ripped his tunic off, his muscled back and shoulders gleaming in the firelight, and shifted. The change was brutally fast, a violent tearing of flesh and reforming of bone. Where the man had stood, a massive black wolf now stood, its fur the color of midnight, its eyes the same intelligent, piercing gray. The wolf was enormous, larger than any she had ever seen, a creature of myth and power. He didn't hesitate. He charged into the burning stable. Orla watched, her heart in her throat. The roof was groaning, ready to collapse. He emerged moments later, nudging a terrified, whimpering mare before him. He went back in. Again and again, he herded the panicked animals out of the flames, his dark form a silhouette against the roaring inferno. Just as he pushed the last horse free, a massive beam burned through, crashed down across the stable entrance, trapping him inside. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Orla dropped her bucket. She didn't think. She ran. She scrambled over the fallen beam, ignoring the heat that seared her skin and the smoke that clawed at her lungs. Inside, it was a hell of fire and shadow. She saw him, the great wolf, pinned by a smaller, smoldering piece of timber, his back leg trapped. He was struggling, snarling in a mixture of pain and frustration. "Rorik!" she screamed. His head snapped up, his gray eyes finding hers through the smoke. He stopped struggling. He went still, watching her. She grabbed a fallen piece of wood, using it as a lever, putting all of her weight into it, trying to shift the timber pinning him. It was too heavy. Her muscles screamed in protest. Tears of smoke and frustration streamed down her face. It wouldn't budge. He let out a soft whine. Then he focused his gaze on her, and she felt a thought press into her mind. Not words, but an image, a feeling. The joint. Push at the joint. She looked where he indicated. A section of the timber was already cracked, weakened by the fire. She wedged her lever into the crack and pushed. The wood groaned, splintered, and then broke. He scrambled free, shaking his massive head. He nudged her, a surprisingly gentle press of his huge muzzle against her side, pushing her toward the exit. They clambered back out into the night air, just as the rest of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. She fell to her knees, coughing, her lungs aching. He shifted back, the transformation just as swift, leaving him naked and soot-stained. He ignored his own state, kneeling in front of her, his hands hovering over her as if he were afraid to touch her. He saw the angry red burn on her forearm, where a spark had landed. His face tightened, a deep and terrible anger in his eyes, not at her, but at the fire, at the world, for hurting her. He reached out, his touch impossibly gentle, and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. The simple contact sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the bond, flaring to life between them, bright and hot and undeniable. In that moment, watching him risk his life not as a king, but as a wolf, seeing the raw, protective fury in his eyes when he saw she was hurt, she finally understood. This was real. This man, this king, this wolf. He was hers. And she, somehow, was his. The thought didn't feel like a cage. It felt like an anchor. She made the choice before he asked. As she cleaned and bandaged the burns on his arms later that night in her small room, the silence was different. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was full, companionable. "I'll come back with you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He stopped breathing for a second. His head came up, and his gray eyes searched hers. He was looking for doubt, for coercion, for fear. He found none, only a steady resolve that mirrored his own. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I am," she said, "but not as a scrubber." A slow smile touched his lips for the very first time. It transformed his harsh face, making him look younger, less burdened. "No," he agreed, "not as a scrubber." The journey back to the capital was nothing like her lonely flight from it. They rode together, Rorik setting a slow pace as if he wanted to stretch the time. He spoke to her, not of politics or kingdoms, but of small things. He told her about growing up in the northern mountains, about the way the snow muffled all sound, about his first clumsy shift as a boy. He asked her about her life, and he listened. He actually listened. He learned about the chipped tooth she'd gotten falling out of an apple tree, about her love for the scent of baking bread, about the way she'd taught herself to read, using discarded almanacs from the castle library. He was learning the map of her, the geography of her small, quiet life, and he treated it with the reverence he would a royal charter. When they arrived at the castle, the guards at the gate stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief, as their king rode in with a common, soot-stained woman riding in front of him, held securely in his arms. He ignored their stares. He dismounted and lifted her down as if she were made of spun glass. His first act was not to go to the council, but to the household staff. He gathered them in the great hall, a place Orla had only ever been in to scrub. He stood before them, with her at his side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He found Myrta in the crowd, her face pale with shock. "Orla has returned," Rorick announced, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "She will be treated with the respect due to my chosen." He did not say queen. He did not say mate. The word hung in the air, potent and absolute. "Myrta," he said, his gaze pinning the housekeeper, "your services are no longer required. You taught those under your charge that their worth was conditional. You taught them to be small. There is no place for that here." He wasn't angry. He was cold, precise, and utterly final. Myrta was escorted from the hall, her pinched face a mask of fury and humiliation. In that moment, Rorick wasn't just claiming Orla. He was defending the very idea of her, protecting the space she deserved to occupy. Later that evening, he led her not to the royal apartments, but to the throne room. The vast hall was empty, lit only by a few torches that cast long, dancing shadows. The two massive thrones sat on their dais, silent and imposing. Orla had scrubbed the floor around them 1,000 times, always feeling like an intruder. Rorick didn't lead her to the thrones. He stopped in the center of the room and turned to face her. He took both of her hands in his. They were chapped and scarred from years of harsh soap and hard work. He lifted them to his lips and kissed each knuckle. "I have been a king for 10 years, he said, his voice resonating in the quiet hall. "I have commanded armies, signed treaties, judged men. But I have been a blind fool." He looked into her eyes, and she felt as if he were seeing straight into her soul. "I want to see you, Orla. Not the idea of you, not the other half of my soul. You." He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her forehead. "I see the weariness in your eyes, because you have never known a day of true rest. I see the strength in your hands, that have worked when they should have been idle. I see the scar on your knuckle from a lie burn you got in my service, a mark of my own neglect." His voice grew thick. "I see the way you hold your breath when you think no one is watching, as if you are trying to take up less space in the world." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. He was seeing her. Not an idealized version, not a queen in waiting, but the small, broken, fiercely surviving woman she actually was. He saw all of her flaws, all of her history, all of her quiet pains, and he was not turning away. "Let me see you," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Always." He lowered his head, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck, just over her pulse point. She shivered, her head falling back in surrender. This was not about power or duty or politics. This was about two broken people finding their solace. He sank his teeth into her neck, a sharp, brief pain that blossomed into a wave of warmth that flooded her entire body. The bond, torn and frayed, snapped into place, whole and brilliant and overwhelmingly complete. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. He lifted his head, licking the wound clean, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. He had marked her, claimed her, but it did not feel like possession. It felt like a promise, a vow to see and to be seen. She was Orla. She was the king's mate. She was a woman who had spent her life being invisible, and for the first time, standing in the arms of the most powerful man in the world, she felt the terrifying, magnificent, and profound relief of finally being known. To be seen accurately, it was more precious than any